Good afternoon, and welcome to the Barefoot Bay Recreation District Board of Trustees Workshop for Tuesday, April 28, 2020, at DMD at 1 p.m. Ms. Henderson, would you please do the Pledge of Allegiance? To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you for coming. Trustee Compton, would you like to do the roll call?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman Kloski, are you here?
Yes.
Trustee Henderson? Yes. Trustee Mino?
Yes.
Trustee Compton is here. Trustee Loveland?
Yes.
We also have with us Mr. John Coffey, our district manager, Ms. Stephanie Brown, our district clerk. Legal counsel Cliff Reppinger is not with us today. We have our property services manager, Matt Getz, our resident relations manager, Rich Armington, with us, our food and beverage manager, Ms. Kathy Mendez, Ernie Cruz, our golf operations manager, and I thought I heard Charles Henley, our finance manager. Oh, okay. And we have Mr. Henley, our finance manager, here with us today as well. We have a quorum, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Roger. This is the first of 4 FY21 working draft proposed budget reviews, and I'll turn it over now to John for an overview by the community manager.
Mr. Chairman, trustees, those watching at home or in Building A. Normally this is a process where, based on resident and trustee input, we're probably 95% there. Needless to say, we're not in ordinary times. So I have a real brief PowerPoint presentation to summarize things, and I won't read every line, but as most folks know, the budget presented to you was based before the coronavirus pandemic impact, layoff, and closures. No one really knows the future of reopenings and level of service. We at a staff level cannot properly revise the FY21 numbers without some consensus from the board on the length, severity of the pandemic and what we think the economy is going to do. And any adjustments to the budget that you adopt the end of June will probably require modifications as we go through the year. The FY20 year-end estimates were based on the assumption that all the projects budgeted would be completed unless otherwise noted. That largely is true. There's a couple minor ones that we now don't have a lot of confidence in completing. It also has started last year planning. It's based on a $350,000 bank loan this year. Mr. Reppinger was able to speak with bond counsel or financial advisors and does take the opinion that validation process is required, and that's a 3 to 5 month process. The first step of that, if you choose to proceed with seeking a bank loan, would be to hire a bond counsel financial advisor that normally works as a percentage of the debt issuance, but because this is a smaller loan in the big scope of things, it probably is going to be a specific fee. If you want to do that, we possibly can have that on the May 8th agenda. And as of now, we believe the pandemic impact with certain scenarios assumed would have about a $92,000 negative impact on the end of this year. The FY21 budget is based, nothing's changed from the 5-year plan, a $2 a month increase in assessment. The loan for next year has been modified to $1 million loan with a 7-year repayment. 10% increase in golf membership fees, 2.5% food and beverage prices, and $34,000 in use of fund balance just to round everything to the penny. The expenditure side, continued pay plan, 5% maximum split between a COLA and merit increase, 15% health insurance. No one really has a clue right now how the renewals are going to come in with the impact of the pandemic. Health-wise, our employees have not had major problems in this last year, so hopefully we can see some savings from there. Dental increase 2%. We estimate 5% decrease in workers' comp rates because our risk management program has been continuing to keep people safe, and we haven't had a lot of big dollar claims. 0% liability rate increase. They'll probably go up a little due to adding some additional assets like sheds and stuff to it. There's 3 recommended decision points on the operations side, totaling about $103,000, the $1.5 million in projects, and $126,000 in contingency. Personnel side, there is a proposed increase of 0.67 FTE custodians for the beach restroom cleaning. This is something that we had thought we would be able to piggyback off of a cleaning service. As you know, we found out that the county has their own cleaning crew. They don't use a private vendor. And also the base budget had been adjusted for food and beverage. We don't believe we were the most accurate in counting our FTEs in prior years. And the golf course was forced to add some part-time positions due to the Department of Labor increasingly negative take on volunteer positions. Issues needing to be addressed today. The 4 biggies, in my opinion, is some consensus of what we think the pandemic's going to do going forward, the economic forecast, whether we're going to pursue the bank loans or not in this year and next year, and what are your overall priorities as far as plugging the gap in expenditures and revenues. So there's multiple ways. I could have had 4 pages, but specifically we can reduce spending, we can increase the loan amounts, we can delete or postpone some projects. Personnel side, we currently have a hiring freeze in place right now. And then next week when we come back, there's always the option of additional increase in assessment. As I said, cut or delay projects or temporarily go under minimum fund balance policy. The 2 big projects are the golf course project and the lounge project. Mr. Cruz has show and tell later for the golf course irrigation project because in January we had it based on the old type of heads requiring satellite boxes. The working draft proposed budget that I presented to y'all is based on the new type of heads that don't require satellite boxes. The new type of heads costs 40% more, but don't require the satellite boxes. So Mr. Cruz has brought an example of each if you'd like to discuss that. Can always try to reduce personnel operating expenses to take some of the edge off of problems, but please bear in mind that our personnel and operating directly impacts services rendered, so if we try to put too much of the balancing there, it will impact services. And with that, we are open for any questions you have. And if there's not any immediate questions, I'll open up the conference line if that's your wishes, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any questions for John on this right now?
Just a couple of understanding a couple of things. When we looked at the deficit, revenues, expenses since we closed things down, that's from when, like around March, when we closed March 16th to the end of the fiscal year, correct? Okay. Can you just tell me again, what is this validation? I'm not familiar with that.
A validation is basically a court process that, and I hate to define a word with the word, but validates the government's right to issue typically tax-exempt bonds in Florida. Cliff's advice is that it applies to anything over the $25,000 borrowing, $25,000 threshold in our charter. Anything over that should be validated. Basically, we would file a court action to get a judge to review our planned debt issuance and say it's in accordance with the law. It's typically a 3-month process if the courts are operating normally. You know, we all know the courts have been closed to non-urgent matters, and there's also an appeal process to where someone in the community could appeal it that could delay it. Likelihood of appeal is low, but it's always there. Typically, the validation process deals around with the issue of tax exemptness of bonds, but we've been told it applies to borrowing also.
And that takes months? That's a Florida thing? I've never heard of it before. That must be a Florida thing.
Cliff probably be the
Yeah,
best one to
okay.
answer that.
Did our loan for the, we didn't take out a loan for the,
You can't hear. You gotta.
I can
Sorry.
see where Ms. Henderson is going on this. She's inquiring about 4 years ago. We did a 5-year loan for approximately $175,000 for stormwater projects and equipment. And the answer I was given was, in hindsight, yes, we should have validated it. But because back then, that was before the era of trying to borrow $9 million, it didn't rise to the radar. But in hindsight, we should have validated that loan.
Mr. Coffey, you said one option would be to take that $350,000 out of the fund balance for this year. What's the longer-term impact of taking that money this year out of the fund balance? I recognize we'll go below the recommended margin or level, but
Yeah, a very, very good question. It basically causes you, instead of having to delay or delete projects this year, you would have to go into the out year forecast and make adjustments there or increase revenues. You know, typically fund balance is there for emergencies.
Right.
The auditors typically, if you spend, auditors love it when you bring in more money than you spend. I like that when my wife and I do that on a monthly basis, but there's times in our household, it's called vacations, where we spend more than we take in. Auditors don't have understanding that you save up money to spend it. And so in prior years, when I first got here, Mr. Klosky was famous for saying he wanted, I started in FY14, and he would say, I want the FY12 projects done before the FY13 projects are done, before the FY14 projects are done. We got them all done in the same year, and then when the audit was done that year, we didn't get a formal finding, but there was a 5 criteria test done because we spent more money than we took in that year. Overall, we spent the money that hadn't been spent in prior years. And so if we borrowed it from, the auditors are concerned organizations will run out of money down the road. That's why they do that 5 criteria test. If you can show them where you've adopted a budget that's based on going below minimum fund balance for a year or two as a result of the pandemic or and that would be primarily the factor when you look at over a couple years, you'll probably get that 5 criteria test, but you're not going to get a bad audit. What they're going to look very closely is, do you get back up to that 20%? Right. Now, here's where the rubber meets the road. the board could change their minimum fund balance policy to 15% and not deal with that that 5 criteria test. There is no hard, firm number of a minimum fund balance. Prior to FY14, Barefoot Bay didn't have a minimum fund balance policy. They operated on the premise more money was better because they had a hard time paying their bills in the early 2000s. So there's a couple different options that could be taken if the board doesn't want to pursue that $350,000 loan.
And clearly, this would be a period that could be called an emergency. So it's not unreasonable to say, well, we're going to pull $350,000 out of our fund balance this year, and then not knowing what next year is going to look like, and if next year doesn't come back, that would be the point to probably go in and take out a loan to carry us through, and then to refund that amount of that fund balance. Yes or no?
Largely agree with you. I think, as I mentioned at the very first slide, Mr. Henley and we watch the finances on a monthly basis. And this coming year, regardless, the odds of us accurately predicting what the future will hold is virtually zero. So we're going to have to adjust this budget throughout the year, and the worst thing an organization can do is wait too long to make the adjustments, because and typically you get into these things during recessions. If you wait till mid-year to make your budget cuts, you have to cut twice as deep as you do if you do it earlier in the year, because half the year is gone. So we're not going to let the organization get into the situation where we're next year at this point saying, oh, we've got a huge hole we've got to fill for the end of the year. So I think that is one option the board might want to consider. They're doing these individual loans because there is also one for folks who've read the 5-year plan. There's also one planned in FY22 for $400,000. Especially with the validation costs, there is a higher cost than borrowing one big loan. But I think most of us recognize this community doesn't have a lot of appetite for big loans either. And so that's something that I think the board needs to weigh. You all have the pulse of the community the best, in my opinion. Once we can get our numbers refined next year, I think that'll help you make that decision one way or the other.
But for this year, to complete the projects that's already in the plan and scheduled, we need $350,000 either from the fund balance or from a loan to complete what's scheduled for this year. Do I understand that right?
Plus that $92,000.
Plus the loss that we're going to take in the $92,000.
And that's based on our preliminary review. Mr. Henley and I, every Monday morning, we're reviewing the weeks prior one-time social membership, because it's a significant source of money for us, and it's also an indicator of the local economy. Since the pandemic started, it's been a roller coaster ride. The only thing we haven't had is the water effect, because one week it'll be way down, the next week it'll be more than last year. And so I think we're still early. Most people, from my perspective, when you move cross country, you don't decide on Tuesday you're moving to Florida and close on your house next Wednesday. There's several months involved. So we have the cash on hand if we don't do the bank loan to pay our bills through the end of the year. We'll be below our minimum fund balance, but we'll be able to pay our bills. And that's the most important thing the auditors look at.
And still leave a significant amount in the fund balance.
Yes.
Going into 2021.
The question they'd want to see is, are we able to get back to where we say we should be?
We say we should be. The $92,000 that you've forecast in the deficit for this year, was was that looking at the same level of activity through the end of this year?
That was based largely, like food and beverage is shut down right now. The assumption was on June 1, and this was something that we did last week. And if you don't like the news today, wait till tomorrow. It seems it changes on a daily basis. But the food and beverage assumption is based on beverage-only sales at the 19th Hole and Lounge on limited hours starting in June 1 through the end of the year. No pasta night, no special events, no catering. And that was that assumption. I think it's a safe assumption because it's largely revenue neutral. I don't think we're going to see a wild swing of that 92,000. This time next week, that number might be 70 or it might be 110. It's not going to be 300,000.
All right, thank you.
So, John, when we staying on that $350,000 number in the loan, again, I know we have so much information we get, it's hard to understand exactly where we are. That $350,000 loan is for things that are already in the budget, like, but not the lounge expansion. No, not the sprinkler systems and all of that. That big thing.
Those are next year. The 350 was based on it got put in the plan.
The pit building, the
Yeah.
roofs, all of that stuff.
Some the examples of what impacts that 350,000 is and this is like being at the beach where the waves keep coming on to the beach and this and that. We had initially the electrical infrastructure and the kitchen in the budget at one time. It got taken out. And as it got put back in, mid-year. The roof on Building C that we have out for bid right now, estimated $130,000. That was never formally in the budget. And so it's for items that have been planned to be done, but either were taken out of the budget and never rebudgeted, or have been priority issues added back in. The lounge re-roofing project is an example. It was in the budget, I believe, in FY17. It got taken out. It was part of the borrowing $9 million. It got taken back out when that was killed. When we were looking to tear the building down and redo it, we're not going to put a roof on something we tear down. And then late last year, when we found out we don't have the parking to tear it down and build a new one, that's when I approached the board saying we really need to replace this roof now rather than just keep kicking it down the road.
But the drawings for the lounge, that's included in that, isn't it? The $92,000 is part of that 350?
Yes, that's no, the 350 is, it's not geared to, and I know this is hard for folks at home to understand.
It's hard for me to understand.
The 350 is basically, and this sounds poor, but it's to plug our cash flow to keep us above the minimum 20%.
But still, that is an expenditure out of that cash flow problem is the $92,000, right?
That was
this year.
Yes, but that was a budgeted expense too.
Right. But the only reason I ask is, if you're looking, not saying we're doing this, if we're looking at discussing things that we may or may not do, I'm trying to figure out if we already have something going that would be, as an example of the loan. Let's say we did not take a loan out for the lounge, we didn't go on with that. Mm-hmm. We postponed some things, we got all kinds of scenarios out there. But that would already be done?
Well, it's in the process.
It's in the process.
If the board said on May 8th to stop that project, we probably have incurred less than 25% of the cost.
Okay. The other question only, you said there's no minimum, and so there's no state requirement that says if we as whatever we are, this body goes below a minimum budget, we don't have to put together a deficit reduction plan to meet anybody's needs?
No.
It's just our own, we set this as the 20% limit.
We said it,
Okay.
18 to 20% is my
Okay.
my understanding, average for communities our size. There are some communities that have 50% of their budget as a minimum fund balance because they're very conservative, or barrier island folks tend to have high fund balances because although the perception of FEMA coming in with buckets of money is a perception a lot of folks have, and you see them handing out things to homeowners, our experience with FEMA has been a 12-plus month turnaround from when you start filing for reimbursement to when you get paid, and insurance reimbursements are a little quicker, but your minimum fund balances, if we had, I like to use isolated tornado, because FEMA's not coming in for an isolated tornado, one that comes down midway and does a lot of damage to Barefoot Bay property. Our insurance is going to reimburse us, but it's going to take us a while. We're not going to be operating anything in the state of this community being destroyed. That would pay our bills for a few months until the insurance money started coming in and we got back on our feet.
And one more question. I'm trying to understand your. I know I went back and read this when I was running for this board, but I don't really understand it. Can you explain really generally what decision points are? You have three decision points.
Yeah. Decision points is the biggest challenge is sifting through all the data. Back in the late 70s, there was a budgeting fad called zero-based budgeting. You start at zero and you justify everything. Well, if we did that in Barefoot Bay, we'd be fooling ourselves that we're going to consider having a golf course next year. We're going to have a golf course next year no matter what. So working on a scenario where you question every expenditure is not, in my opinion, the most useful time for residents and trustees. The FY21 budget is a combination of a base budget and decision points. Base budget is your recurring costs, and we just don't ask for a blank check. We put detail in there for folks who have an interest of what our recurring expenses are. And then optional items are put through for operating in the form of decision points, which helps you as a board and the community discuss, is it a good decision to hire extra people to clean the bathrooms at the beach, or do we give everybody a box of Clorox wipes when they head out of here and say, oh, tidy up the bathroom before you leave, please, because we don't have a cleaning crew for it. The look I just got from Trustee Henderson was priceless on that. But so it's basically the optional changes to the budget that's outside of recurring costs.
Thank you.
I want to ask, if you take the $350,000 from the fund balance instead of borrowing, could we be able to repay it back in the 2 years? Or we would have to cut a few projects from the FY21 to help us with this, or what? How could?
Without pulling it up,
Okay.
it would be a challenge. We definitely could balance. I would encourage you, if we were going to do that, to spend some time next week looking at FY21 and the FY22 projects, because I believe if you, and we probably would adopt a formal resolution for the auditor's sake of saying by the end of FY22 we'll be back at our 20% fund balance. I think it's going to be okay. It's not ideal, but the question you get into that is, both 21 and 22 have lounge expansion and golf course irrigation projects that are big ticket items. And so without changing them or increasing the amount of borrowing, it gets really hard to make significant changes when you don't touch the biggest pieces in the pie.
Okay, next question is, this is just pulling it out of the hat, is the way we're going now, when the FY 20 fiscal year ends, I just wonder how bad will we be? Will we be in a state where we didn't do as bad as we anticipated, even though they were not making any income now with the lounge closed and everything's shut down and everything, but we're saving money other ways? Would that, what kind of a picture would that be?
Well, assuming we take the bank loan, I think we'll be less than $100,000 off of where we projected. And we projected being right about the 20% fund balance. I'll just take this moment because you've shared with me some of the comments in the community, and I've gotten a few emails from residents of, we want a rebate on our assessments because the amenities have been closed for a few weeks. Well, when you get your budget mail out next month, or in early June, I should say, if you look at it real closely, you'll see our assessments cover 60% of our annual budget. So overall, there's a lot of cities and counties who would love to be in our position, because if this is a deep or long recession, our assessments don't drop automatically like property taxes that are based on value of properties do. The challenge is always at the margins because, as you know, Mr. Klosky, we try to give you a very detailed budget. We try to execute what it is. We don't overestimate revenues. We don't underestimate them. And so part of the pain of last month of laying off our staff and closing the pools and stuff is knowing recreation is the reason we all are here. And most of our residents move here for different recreation opportunities. And basically shutting that down was something no one ever envisioned or wanted to do. But, you know, there's things greater than recreation. So I don't think we're as in bad shape as other places could be. And, you know, the 51 folks we laid off, I'll call out the elephant in the room. It's a very difficult decision because most of them know I was the one who authorized doing it. And I would see people coming in to be notified. And it's not anything I wanted to do, but if we would have kept those 51 people on all summer long, we'd had a lot deeper hole than 92,000.
But my question there would be, if you did keep all 50 or 51, what would they be doing? Because if the food and beverage is totally down, so they actually you'd be spending money on something, and we're not accomplishing anything.
Well, and that's exactly, we've worked together my 6.5 years here, and that was what I communicated to y'all.
I understand
is that however painful it is for us and for those directly affected, I believe we right-sized our workforce to our revenues, thereby minimizing the impact to this year's budget and next year's budget. Because in a nutshell, next year's budget is that 92,000 you lose this year, you've lost it next year too, plus you've lost more next year. So it's compounding. Everybody loves compounding interest. Compounding debt can be just as painful in the other direction.
But John, that brings up a
Thank you.
question that I had also written down. So the 92, I understand that the way I had it figured too, okay, we're going to be $100,000 deficit this year. and keep, if we had 350,000 and we do all that, we're still gonna be 100,000 down, right? So is it your idea that we should, not us, you should be doing something to balance that also, or not? Or just say, no, we're gonna eat that?
Well-
Because you are gonna eat it twice. You're gonna eat it next year too.
And that's part of today, if, you know, the Great Recession, most people didn't see it being as deep as it was, but those of us who've worked for a while, we've been through recessions, we understand the cycle. Unless you're 115 years old, you don't remember the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. And so this is where I think it's helpful. There's three groups, in my opinion, who are impacted by this. There's staff and the employees, you as decision makers, and then the community as large. And none of us are going to agree on what the likely scenario going forward is, but if we can agree what we think is the most likely, at least they can understand why we are going to adopt the budget the way we do. Right now, there's folks out there, because I get emails, phone calls on a daily basis. One today was, you shouldn't have shut anything down. This is all overblown. And then other people saying we need to keep everything shut down through the end of the year. So part of this is a communication effort that I think the 92,000 is very realistic, plus or minus a little. That's based on like a hiring freeze. Mr. Henley had 2 positions that he had recruited, spent a lot of time, background checks and face-to-face interviews. They were both supposed to start on March 16th. Somehow one of them got a wire crossed and thought he was supposed, or she was supposed to start on March 17th. March 16th, I started a hiring freeze. So one person started on the right day, because my hiring freeze went into effect in the afternoon when I got here. The other person got a phone call saying, I'm sorry, we don't have a job now because we've got a hiring freeze because of the pandemic. There's basically 2 positions that are exempt from the hiring freeze, and those are critical positions. If we keep the hiring freeze in place long term, there's some that we're going to have to, Mr. Getz's folks out at Falcon Drive. 1 or 2 people leave, it doesn't have that much impact on his progress of doing work, but he starts having a lot of turnover, we got to fill those positions. So there's only so much you can do with hiring freezes. There's the employee incentives. We have a very generous, I think, 5% now. We could look at pulling that back into like 2.5% for 1 year. I think the employees would understand that. I think everybody understands these are difficult times, and this is something that I need your input of what's the priorities, because let's just take extremes for now. If the majority of the board says, because of the pandemic, we don't want to raise the assessment, we don't want to borrow money, we don't want to raise golf fees, the only recourse we have is not to do the big capital projects, but I can bring you a budget back on that. If the priorities is those 2 big capital projects, we're probably going to borrow more money. If the importance is taking care of the employees we have and hiring back as many as we can as fast as we can, that's a mixture of things we would attack on. But short of some overall consensus from the board, it's impossible for me to give you a detailed revised budget that meets your expectations.
Well, I understand that, but I guess before we even get to those things that we may want to do, which may or may not be extreme, I'm just trying to make sure we understand it. We don't have that larger budget, $6 or $7 million, whatever it is, with all the projects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we're talking about $100,000, but I think it's fair to say that $100,000 between now and the end of the year, you could in a budget, you can make that balance the budget without doing anything specific to do that right now. I mean, isn't that a fair statement? I mean, $100,000, you know, we've got 75,000 budgeted for here and 75 for this. All of a sudden, you may not do that. So what I'm saying is we don't need to take any action to solve that deficit we know is going to be there. That's not on the table, right?
Correct. If you wanted to erase that 92,000, we probably could defer a couple projects.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. You can move money, you can do things. That's a small amount. So it's the bigger things, the bigger picture that we really have to deal with. Okay.
Any other questions? We can go on the audience.
Welcome to the conferencing center. Please enter. If you are the moderator, press star. Please. Your call has been placed in conference. You are the first caller to join the conference. Please wait for further participants. Your line is now unmuted.
Nobody there?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I'm sorry, I had to step out. I had a comment that I would just like to add. Being that we work on a budget that is all relatively based on projections and presumptions, I think it's wise if we keep in mind some key points. One is that we are operating right now under a virus type of or a pandemic type of situation, meaning that depending on whether you listen to the hysterics or the logic of how this virus is affecting everything, can affect the way that we look at our budget and the way that we project for it. The other piece of it is we are looking at, in November, the majority of this board will be changing, meaning that 3 out of the 5 on this board, which would be a majority vote, will be changing in November. The next thing is bringing staff back on, assuming, again, that all staff that was laid off is willing to come back. If they are not, we're going to have some expensive training costs in there for staff if we have to bring in new staff. The other piece that we have to look at is our expense and our revenue should be equal laterally as they either go down or increase as we look at how we're going to project forward in setting this budget. I think this is a unique year. It definitely is not a year like any other year you've ever set budget in Barefoot Bay. And I think that we have to keep all of these things in mind as we project forward. It is not business as usual.
I certainly agree with you on that. I know that I believe some of these employees will not be hired back real soon to come back and everything. We'll have to go at a slow pace and everything. So depending on when your pools are going to open and when we give them the okay, you'll have some pool hosts coming back. Of course, you'll have to have probably at the pools, maybe 2 pool hosts watching the thing there, monitoring everything. And then eventually if the food and beverage opens, the lounge and everything, you're going to have to go out at 30% capacity. You won't be able to have taco night, taco Tuesday, and all these selling everything food, but you will still have to have at least, so there's in the lounge, you probably only be able to allow 25 people in there, so at the 30% capacity, but then you'll also include the workers that are in there too, so if you're going to keep it at, say, 30%, and 6 of them are workers, so you can only allow 24 people to be in that one thing. And how long are you going to let them stay there and everything? That's what I'm wondering and everything. So, but I don't, it's not a rosy picture going down the road, but I guess it's not as bad as it seems. I don't know. It's hard to say. And when are we going to come back to normalcy at the end of the FY20 fiscal year and start the FY21 on a good note? But I don't think so. I think we're going to have problems there and not having everything to full capacity. I don't really know when we'll even get to full. Probably someplace maybe in January, maybe sometimes next year sometimes. I don't know, it's hard to say, depending how this happens, especially in the winter when the flu season comes back again. Are we gonna be over this epidemic or not? So, but it's gonna be hard. I guess it's gonna be a long road, but I'm just hoping that it's not gonna, that it not gonna hurt the Bay that much. But the other question I got is FEMA give us any reimbursements on any of this stuff, being that we're closed, or anything that had no bearing on that?
For FEMA is reimbursing direct costs related to the pandemic. With the exception of some minor costs in food and beverage, we've not had direct costs.
Okay, thank you. So there is nobody in the lines there, so. So the board want to discuss?
So, Mr. Coffey, you're looking for some type of a consensus as to how to move forward on the budget, is that correct? So, my recommendation would be, we go through the balance of this year, complete the remaining projects that were scheduled. We dip into our fund, which is what it's for. It's for emergencies. We've scaled back on our spending. We'll end up with somewhere around a $90,000 deficit there, which can be covered with our fund balance as well. I also would recommend that we leave fiscal year 21 as is. Since we have no idea what 21 will look like, then it makes no sense to start to change this now. We can always alter these projects. We can make changes to this budget as we get close to 21 and we have a better feel for what it's going to look like. That would be my recommendation.
Mr. Chairman, I think that is a sound recommendation, especially about leaving 21 the way that it is. Because again, I am going to say that you will have a new board come January, and that board will have to deal with what this board's decisions are. And if we put a lot of effort into 21 and not a lot of effort into today, I think that we'd be spinning our wheels. I think that they could come in and they would absolutely change that and take that in a different path. Six months in our life right now is going to make a huge difference.
And we don't know what that's going to look like.
Exactly.
We have no idea. So to start to change things with no real idea.
Well, am I being heard? I think personally, because I've looked into this with different people, that we should borrow the money. I think we should borrow the money because it's going to be less expensive to borrow it now than later. If you spend 2 years, it's a 4-year loan, right? Isn't it a 4-year loan, that $350,000? So to pay it back in 4 years is going to be a whole lot less painful with projects we can't do than if we do it in 2 years. I mean, we'll be paying interest on it, but I think that the interest we pay will probably be not a lot at this point in time. There's also a couple things actually, there's not a whole lot in this year's budget that hasn't been done. There's a couple things at the golf course that haven't been done, and some of the concrete work hasn't. There's really not a lot that hasn't been done in this year's budget, but we have added some things. And I think that $350,000 will be cool. I also think that in next year's budget, there's 3 or 4 projects that really are fat. They don't actually need to be done. There's 4 of them. A lot of them are necessary. A lot of the other projects are necessary to do. Some of them are just, I think, were added because it seemed like a good idea at the time. And that's about $80,000 of stuff, which is, like Mike says, in the long run, isn't a lot of money, but $80,000 is $80,000. That's mine. I think we should borrow the money. I think that that's something that we absolutely should do.
One thing, and I referenced Mr. Cruz with this show and tell, is the next year it would be half of the irrigation replacement. I think one of the things Ms. Henderson was talking about is this year we have in the budget $60,000 to replace the satellite boxes. The budget shows that money not being spent and being used other places because Mr. Cruz had advocated since January going to this new type of head that's 40% more expensive but doesn't require the satellite boxes. Well, when you realize there's a lot more heads than satellite boxes, it ends up costing us more money in the total scope of things. If this board would like to confirm we want to continue using the new heads in next year's budget, or if you want to have us to go back use the old heads, now's the time for Mr. Cruz to be getting the satellite box work done. What we really shouldn't wait to is like end of June to make that decision, because if you want the satellite boxes replaced this year and go back to the old heads, I'm always an advocate of doing as much on the golf course early in the summer than later, because our hurricanes usually come later in the summer. If anybody wants the brief show and tell of the two heads, Mr. Cruz has gotten pretty good at his demonstrations.
I have a question before he starts the show and tell, because I've had the show and tell. The original heads, the ones that are in now that we talked first about replacing, do they last they don't last as long as the new ones? Is that right? Or are they both sort of equal?
Before you start, when are we talking about doing this? Not this summer. Is it this summer or next summer?
The satellite boxes would be done this summer.
2020.
If you want to,
I got you.
If you want to use the old heads, we
And
have
that's
to.
part of the 350,000 that we're talking?
Yes.
Yes,
That's,
okay.
well, there's two 350,000s. I just
Okay.
like to confuse you thoroughly.
Okay.
One is the loan. One is the expenditures for half of the golf course irrigation project next year. Specifically, let me pull up one of those eye-numbing spreadsheets that we all like. Okay. The satellite box, we have 60,000 in the budget this year, right? I'm sorry, I didn't drop the slide. There we go. The satellite boxes, there's 60,000 budgeted. We show zero being expended in that because previously next year's cost for half of the irrigation heads was $250,000, not $350,000. But if you go with the higher priced heads, you don't need the $60,000. The problem with the higher priced heads is you end up paying $200,000 more for the new heads and saving $60,000. It sounds like the typical government, let's save $60,000, we'll only have to spend $200,000 to save $60,000. But the way Mr. Cruz's demonstration showed you, there is a benefit of the new style heads. Before the pandemic, I thought it was a good trade-off, the extra costs. But I do think now, because of the impacts of the pandemic, this is something we ought to review, because if you want to go back to the old heads, we can get you the quote for the satellite boxes to be replaced on the May 8th agenda and get that project going. If you want to stick with the new heads, we don't have to get the satellite boxes replaced, and we'll baby them along for the next couple of years as we replace the irrigation system. Ernie, you
Ernie, is the,
got 5 minutes to show your show and tell.
okay, go ahead.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. And basically, every sprinkler comes in the same canister type thing pretty well. These canisters have been used for many years. And you can see on the outside, you have external, you have solenoids and everything where the electrical components connect. And then you have the actual sprinkler head, which you've probably seen in your yard. It goes up and down, spins around when it's pressurized. This is the existing system we have on a golf course now. What they're doing recently in the past couple of years, they've started doing a sprinkler head. Basically, it's the same exact components, but now you have modules and solenoid boxes and everything that are in a sealed container that go in the ground, so they can warranty a little bit longer, up to 5 years, with these components and everything. And it functions the same way. The only difference is, so let's say that your computer over there, Trustee Loveland, is my computer that tells my water to turn on and off. This head, I can directly communicate from that computer or even from an app on today's cell phone and tell this one computer head to turn on, and I can control the water levels and all that and everything. The old system would require me to have an intermediate system. That's where a satellite box comes in. So I would have on the golf course, anybody who's played golf course, any golf course in the world has seen those green boxes that stick up. Sometimes we've landed behind them or whatever, in an intermediate place. So we'll take guys' telepod there and everything with his video camera as that satellite box. So what would happen is that system over there would send the signal to the satellite box, and I can manually control everything from the satellite box to the heads. These are usually turned on in zones. So I can't necessarily isolate these all the way, because as to where with the new system, each computer has its own module and it comes directly to that satellite box only has so many stations. So I piggyback on those stations, so you would have sometimes 2 to 4 heads connected. So that's why when you see on a golf course, you see one head come on, usually on the opposite side, a parallel point, you see a second head come on. You know, it's a lot harder to isolate just one head. So they both work exactly the same. They'll both suffice water, provide the water and everything like that. This one's a little bit more durable with the new components and everything they're doing. This is the old one, will work just as well, but it does require the satellite boxes.
What do we have now, Ernie?
We have this style.
With satellite boxes?
With the satellite boxes.
And so the satellite boxes are old and gone or something? Is that the idea or what?
The satellite boxes, imagine that laptop being from 2003. And imagine with electrical components and everything in it that send the signals and everything with all the lightning we've had over the years and everything. Right now we have some satellite boxes that should have, let's say it should have 8 cards in it. If you were to rip your computer apart and look at the motherboards and all that and everything, you'd have boards in there to where they're supposed to control so many stations. Some of the satellite boxes, we've only got half the stations on, and because we've only got half the stations, we have to put more heads. So therefore, when we water, you'll see 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 heads come on the golf course versus 1 or 2. So they are very, not that they're antiquated, they work, and we jump them and keep going them, but they're just very old and outdated, and we would replace them with the newer type satellite boxes.
When you, and they go on in zones, as you're saying in zones, when you set the zones from where? In the satellite box itself or from a computer?
The zones are set in the satellite boxes, and then they're linked up to the computer to those boxes. So let's say you have 4 boards on your satellite box. On one of those boards, hole number 1 is on one of those boards. Then I would go to the computer, and in that computer, I would say, okay, I want you to run heads 1, 2, and 3 on zone 1 for 10 minutes at 100% pressure. I want you to run heads 4, 5, and 6 for 5 minutes at 50% pressure. So it's an integrated system that
And
works
that's with
together.
the satellite box?
With the
So
satellite
what's,
box,
so
yes.
then what is the difference with the other one then? What would you be able to do there? I don't quite get that. I don't
Because
understand.
you have an independent module that allows me to directly communicate with just this head and
From the
only this
computer.
head from the computer directly. So you're basically eliminating the satellite box and you have more control of water and everything that you're doing.
And Ernie, your preference would be to replace the satellite boxes and stay with the old style, or to replace the system with the new system?
My preference is to have water on the golf course.
Yeah, I know that. I know that. My question is, though, you
But
as
it's a
the
legitimate
expert-
question, Roger, you know, it is, yeah. But I mean, and you know he would rather have the new boxes, I'm sure, but the other ones with, I guess, Roger, it's a great question. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but the point, I guess, is that the old system now is not working properly simply because it's so old. Is that correct, I mean?
That is correct.
And so if you replace the old system with the new heads and new satellite boxes, we're back being more operational. I mean, better proficiency and everything, just because we get rid of the old stuff. Is that right? I mean,
To answer your question as honestly as possible, either one of these two would work, because when we talk about replacing the old system, we're talking about replacing the old components and everything like that. So anything new in there would be new. So you can extrapolate or make your best guess as to, if we've had an irrigation system out there since 2003 that's been operating up to 2020, you can form your own opinion as to whether or not you believe if we put every new component in there, that should logically last a certain amount of time as well.
but again, the heads, those old heads, they're going to do the job. It's whether or not we have them in the right places and all of that was the other question we talked about months ago. But the point is, they're still going to provide the water we need, just a little more efficiently because of new components.
Yeah, and maybe I wasn't clear enough. So this is an old head. This has been in there. The new heads they're making nowadays are the same heads that go in the system. These components are interchangeable with each other. It's just whether or not you have external, internal, how you route them and everything like that. So the guts of the system will operate really well with either one.
And it makes no difference with regards to the feeder lines and all that are run, which heads you're using.
I'm sorry?
The lines, the water lines that feed the heads, it makes no difference as far as those are concerned, which heads you're using, I'm assuming.
That's all in the quote of the system. All those lines and everything would be replaced and everything. So you would get a whole new
But you would have to
irrigation
do that with this too.
No, this one is just on a stand. This one is on a stand, but the canister, it's the same exact concept. It's just a pipe that gets threaded in there. You can unthread this out to take it out if you need to replace the whole component, or we can just take out the inner part and replace the inner part. In this case, we would have to do some digging, because you'd have to do, if the solenoid went bad or something like that. In this case, you just untwist the whole component and take it out of the ground and put in a new component. But the inners, the sprinkler heads themselves are both going to shoot the same 100 PSI and everything, so.
And John, the difference in cost again in this was what?
Splitting the project in half, it's $250 a year versus $350 a year. The $350 doesn't require the $60,000 satellite boxes. The $250 does.
And the satellite boxes were going in this summer?
Yes.
So the satellite boxes were going to go in with the old sprinkler heads?
Yeah, the plan that had been in play for a few years was to do the design and irrigation, and then, the design satellite boxes, and then the half and half of the actual heads and piping.
I just thought if you, just for a little bit better understanding, so when we originally started this irrigation project discussion, it had already been a few years, and this had not been in existence. So I just felt it would be, you know, for me to give you as much information for you to make your decision, I wanted to at least present to you that this is also available versus this now, as to where a few years ago, this enclosed system was not available.
One system doesn't last any longer than the other. One head doesn't last any longer than the other.
The components are components,
And they're gonna-
regardless of what they are. Understand they're not like a yard or anything like that. These heads will turn on once a day, every day, 365 days a year, unless we have some kind of storm that waters us out like crazy, sometimes 2 to 3 times a day, depending on. So that's why the system we have out there now is so antiquated, because some of these heads, they've not made these inner parts. Like this piece I'm holding in my hand right now, the last time this was manufactured was in 2015. So for me to replace this, I have to upgrade to a newer head, and that's where the cost is coming up a little bit different now, because I have to change this style because they just don't make that piece anymore.
Ernie, how many sprinkler heads are there altogether?
There's 485 sprinkler heads on the golf course. 2 pumps, 1 jockey pump, 1 Toro computer, transformers, and I can keep going and going and going if you like.
Okay, and what about your satellite boxes? How many of them are there?
6 satellite boxes.
6 satellite boxes?
So is our discussion, again, very, very interesting, by the way, but is our discussion, are we trying to decide whether or not we should go ahead with the satellite boxes this summer then? Is that the point, or what?
Yes, because if you, put in a nutshell, if you want to do this the most economical way over the next 2 years, we probably should go back, do the satellite boxes, and go back to the old heads, and that would take $200,000 out of the budget over the next 2 years.
And that's budgeted already, the 60,000 is budgeted.
It's budgeted, but we figured it zero being spent. Now, where you can flip some money is, we also still showed the 75,000 lake banks. So theoretically, it's a cash revenue neutral this year, because we could scale that back to bare minimums, do the 60,000 down here, which is no net change for 21 and 22. We can shave 100,000 off each year if we go back to the old ones.
Well, Ernie has no preference. He looks at them as being equal as far as what they're able to do. How can you not go with the most cost-effective approach? I don't know how it's even a discussion, really.
I agree, Roger. I think as we're looking at all the expenses, and I'm all for doing what we can at the golf course, believe me, but as we look at all the things we're doing, and we're possibly talking about, you know, cutting back on increases in employees and all the different things, if we can save $100,000 a year or whatever it is, I think we definitely have to look at that. As long as Ernie thinks we're going to be able to provide the same level of watering that is necessary, and it's going to, you know, I just think, yeah, I agree with you.
Either system, you are going to vastly improve your watering system, because right now it's very antiquated. So
We cut $100,000 out of that this year. That's that $93,000 we're going to be short, right?
Well, the 100,000 is the next 2 years.
No, it's the next 2 years.
Oh,
But again,
21,
we're also,
22, okay.
we're talking about the 75,000 too that we may not use. I mean, that was the 75 I referenced earlier. So what I'm saying is, Roger, there are things in this budget that, you know, I don't want to say you move money around, but I mean, you can make things happen in a budget because you simply don't spend certain things at certain times, and all of a sudden, you know, but if you can save something specific, then I think you have to look at doing it. That's my point.
And boss, I can, with the lake bank projects, Matt has helped me shore up some lake banks before. We can definitely shore up some lake bank areas that need some refurbishing, and move that over.
And I'm not saying we should do that. I'm saying that's a possibility that may not happen, so you have to look at it that way.
Any other questions?
Well, let me just
Go ahead.
loop around, because Overall discussions, trustee Compton suggested leaving 21 alone. I think based on his comments on the golf course irrigation, he'd be fine with the $100,000 decrease. Trustee Loveland was in concurrence with that. Trustee Henderson wanted to borrow the money this year instead of using fund balance. So you're close to having a consensus, Mr. Chairman, if you and Trustee Minot.
Well, what is when you're talking about the 21, you know, I'm not in favor of just saying we just leave everything that we talked about in 21 as it is. But the point is, and maybe Roger said this, does it really make any difference right now?
No, that was my point. We don't know what 21's going to look like because of the coronavirus thing.
No, it's not that, though. I don't mean what it's going to look like. I mean, is there anything that we would be doing in the 2020 budget that would affect 21 budget? So,
I think
as an
the
example,
answer is no.
let me go back to the lounge expansion. Are we going to spend $92,000 and all of a sudden have things be so bad that we have to put the lounge on hold? And all of a sudden, we spent $92,000 on a drawing. I mean, that's all I hear about, and people don't understand it. I realize that, but all I hear about is that the things we do for drawings, et cetera, they don't understand how things work. You have to have those drawings. I'm just saying, if you say we're simply going to leave 21 alone, does that mean that $92,000 is going to be spent in 2020?
Unless you direct me to stop that
Well, that's the point I'm putting out.
It's going to be spent. And I understand exactly your comment. You know, I've had comments that you don't need construction drawings and stuff. The folks find out when they go to permitting that they do.
Right, I didn't mean, I know they don't understand it. I'm very familiar with having to pay for those drawings, believe me.
The pros and cons, we can, if there's something specific in FY21 as presented that the board wants to change, we can change that. I think Trustee Compton and Loveland, you know, they have a very good point. No matter what we do, we're probably going to be back here in September and October changing the 21 budget again. This is a normally we bring budget amendments back for specific projects or to carry forward projects that were uncompleted. This is going to be a very different year in that as we see how things fold out. Right now we have $100,000+ in music and entertainment in property services. You could very well see that not being expended. Food and beverages budget is geared towards full service, maximum hours of service. As we go to gradually reopen, we're going to reopen probably beverage service only, limited hours. We're going to shock people, but we're going to make money at first. So overall, with the exception of not knowing how one-time social memberships come out, the impact on the golf course, if you understand that this is a budget that's going to require flexibility going forward, it can be adopted without minor changes. If you want to go in and adopt it, I think the biggest challenge we have under Trustee Compton's proposal is the public relations side of it, because when this goes out, we'll still probably be largely shut down. We may have a few things open, and it's going to look to people as if the status quo. And Chairman Klosky, who's done this 13 times in the past, can tell you most people don't pay attention to what we do. And I can't blame them. I don't pay attention to the city of West Melbourne because I'm busy working and living my life. But when they get that budget mail out, they get interested at the very last minute. And I think if we understand we're going to have an unhappy crowd who doesn't understand what the board's intent is in the second meeting in June, and we take the time to try to explain it. But we're still going to have folks unhappy with us because they won't understand we're adopting this with the intent that we're going to change it later.
And again, Joe and I have not kind of indicated where we are. Again, we talked about the four proposals, the four concepts of what's going to happen. I really don't, just my own personal opinion, I do not think this is coming back anywhere near soon. Even if they start opening things up, we could have hotspots. We could just go right back to where we were. I don't think the economy is, because places are going to be closed down, I don't think the economy is coming back very quickly. So we're for sure, in my opinion, going all the way through our 2020 year for sure, and going way into the winter of next year. Okay. With that, as part of the things you outlined here, you know, you also said there's possibility of laying some other people off. There's a possibility of going back on already planned increases for employees, et cetera. I think in there we were even talking about, is it necessary possibly at some point to have to raise assessments again to make up general fund? You see my point. When you start looking at all of those things in the future that you may have to do, I sure as hell don't want to be spending money right now in 2020 for something that may, I'm not against the lounge, but may not even happen because we may not ever want to go to a lounge. We may be able to have a lounge where you could fit 20 people in. So I guess that's what I'm trying to get, is that whatever we do here and just say, let's go along with 2021 budget, if there are some things in there that we are spending in 2020 that could then be looked at as saying, why the hell did they do that when this isn't going to happen? I guess we need to make sure we look at that. I'm just throwing this out for discussion because I do not think this economy is coming back anywhere near soon. I am surely not going to be in favor of start saying we have to increase our revenue by raising assessments, et cetera, in the near future. I mean, we have enough people that are unemployed and suffering right now, so I can go along with I would go along with taking the 350 from the fund balance. You know, people used to always tell me, you're not a bank, you don't have to have all of that money. Well, I understand the concept of fund balances, however, but as long as there's no requirement or nothing that says we have to go on a deficit spending plan if we go below, then I could see doing that. But at the same time, I would be in favor of reducing anything that is not absolutely necessary right now so that we don't ever have to look in the next year of having to raise revenue. You know, we're going to put 10% increase in memberships cost at the golf course. I'm not saying we stop that, but I sure don't want to say, you know what, we may have to put another 5% on next year because then all hell's going to break loose. So I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but I think we have to look at reducing and getting things out, whatever we can right now, and then going with the fund balance 350.
Yeah, and you know, there's a couple ways of doing that. I've especially this community of the trying to understand, because I believe, especially Ms. Henderson has heard, we've been promised a restroom at the beach for years. Well, it was in the budget one time, and then a new board came in, didn't want to borrow the money, and it came out of the budget. So here's a list in a different way of what's in the R&M capital projects. Replacement of damaged concrete, $25,000. That's something we don't normally spend unless there's something comes up, so there's potential savings there. When you get down to, and everything else largely, you got the elephant in the room, the Lake Lounge expansion project. Do you need doors and windows? Yeah, it should be done. This is something that we could say, we'll hold off to see how the revenues come in. There's other things, the restroom at the pickleball tennis courts, a trailer restroom. This is something else that we could asterisk up and say, this is a tentative project based on available revenue. Once again, neighborhood revitalization program, people largely agree, it's a good idea, but we don't have to spend that. The outlets, the electrical outlets under the Oaks east of Building A. This is really a want versus a need, same as the sound dampening panels in Building A. These are nice to have. We don't have to do them. So as you say, that's why I say if the board wanted to adopt the budget as it is, we're not going to automatically spend everything because A, we do most of our projects in the summertime, which is the second half of the budget year. And B, the last thing we want to do is not meet your expectations. And your expectation, whether it's spoken or unspoken, is revenues are supposed to exceed expenditures unless, otherwise dictated. So there's some things in here that we probably should do in a timely fashion, like the HVAC units, if we're back selling food, the new cooler freezer at the 19th hole, but other things, but they're all small. Like when you get into bathroom upgrades, $8,600. Don't get me wrong, folks watching at home. That's a lot of money to each of our households. But as Trustee Mino said, out of a $6 million budget, it's pittance. So I think part of the issue is my concern of over-promising a budget and not delivering, because you and Trustee Compton are guaranteed being here next year. I hope.
Maybe not.
I hope. But if we put the restroom trailer in the pickleball in the mail out and it doesn't happen, you'll hear this the rest of your days in here, that you promised it to us and you didn't give it to us.
John, isn't there a way we could adopt that budget, but let the residents know in your mail out that certain things might not be pushed through at that because of, like right now, what you just brought up, you could save only almost $150,000 on those certain projects, and just say they're really not a necessity. So if we don't do them, why don't hold the board to it? Because second thing is you don't know which road we're headed in. So I look at it this way: we don't have a crystal ball where we can say, okay, everything's going to run thing there. Just because you say something down the road, you hit a bumpy road, so you can have to just eliminate it and everything. And I'm sure some of these residents do understand, some don't, but quite a few of them would understand, especially at this time of the scene with this crisis we have and everything. So I agree with Mino on the thing there, but also I don't see a problem in adopting this budget, but maybe give an explanation if we're going to adopt this budget, that there's possibility of eliminating some certain things.
Can you do the budget, can you take out the things that you were talking about, the awning and the pickleball bathroom and da-da-da-da? Can you take them out of the budget and then put in, like at the end, contingency things, contingency projects that, if everything goes well.
You want to throw that money to contingency?
Put them in that way as opposed to putting them in the budget, and then maybe people would get it better.
Can you do that, John?
You know what they're going to do.
We can do anything. The other option is we could, quote, defund those projects and move all that money to the contingency account and specify what the contingency
And then if it does
account is
happen
for.
where we can do it, you just bring it up and say, well, these are the projects we fund, but we can do them now.
Yeah.
So then, in other words, well, and of course, you'll still have some gripes and everything anyway, but I think that's the best way. Thank you. That's a very good thing there, so.
He agreed with you.
So all of those things, I'm sorry, Luann, all of those things in the 21, other than the lounge is a loan. The lounge is going to be that $1 million loan or whatever it is. But all the rest of those things are budgeted just out of our income, our revenues, correct? There are no other loans there, right? Okay. Number two, is it, and that's a good idea, Luann, number two, is it possible to throw up the same screen for 2020? Do you have that there?
I have it in a little different format. just,
The only reason is to say, as we go down those things, is there anything there that we have not done yet that we don't necessarily need to do?
now this format's a little different because, Trustee Henderson and I were talking, and I was starting to explain things. The one thing I'll point out is a couple typos that I hadn't corrected. This page here was supposed to have wrapped around, and there's always, and you see originally this was for 21 and 21's not shown, but you see in the development of this we were playing around with different scenarios. So, you know, this says 400 and it's really supposed to be 3,500, and this was supposed to be $1 million, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is when you come down here, this shows what's completed, what will be completed, and let me go to some of the examples I think you're talking about, Trustee Maino.
By the way, you just went by one, and I had a question about this just because I don't understand it. When you talk about the beach project restrooms,
Yes.
I knew that we just passed something recently to have this done, and it was 80 or 90 some $1,000. What is the 135? Why is that?
The design, the septic, sewer, and electrical, plumbing hookups, we have to move. Right now, the electric.
That's in addition to buying the building?
Buying the building,
Okay.
yes.
All right.
And so we expect that to be 135. Here's an example of where we anticipate some additional savings. So, Building A, retaining wall repairs. We estimate it's 30,000. Probably not going to happen this fiscal year because this is a project that really needs to happen in the winter time due to the water table out there. There's very few companies that specialize in this type of grout and stuff, and everything got, this is, pardon the very bad pun on this one, but this one fell through the cracks. And so there's 30,000 that won't get spent this year, but needs to be spent next year. And that is shopping center electrical design is going to happen. We're hopeful this comes in less. We really don't know at this point. And you see here's where we just made changes of the 7560, but a lot of this is already under project. Here's one that another place picking up 22,000. The sidewalk out in front of this building. First 3 years I worked here, I thought we had a wide curb along this circle here. And then I found out that's called a sidewalk. That 22,000 is meant to take that out and pour a wider sidewalk. We could live with that smaller sidewalk for a little longer due to the pandemic. So there's places where we know, like these projects came in under budget. This project just about at budget. This project hasn't been bid out yet. But a lot of this is, this right here, we may or may not spend this. So we've run into rising property values. This is the neighborhood revitalization program. Rising property values coupled with General Counsel Reppinger's revised opinion on the 25,000 charter. This might be savings right here. And if, I know Mr. Armington will cringe when I say, oh, he's got his mask on, so he's hiding. He'd cringe, but if we didn't spend any more on neighborhood revitalization, that might plug our pandemic aspects. So
all of these things are what I was getting at earlier, and the fact that when we're talking about whether we take the $350,000 loan or not right now, or take it out of fund equity or fund balance, I mean, it might only be $100,000 or $150,000 that actually has to come out. So I again agree that I do not think we should be going for that loan, the $350,000 loan.
What I like to see is adopt the FY21 budget, but at that same time, we'll take out any place between 150, 175,000, put them in a contingency fund, and put those projects that, total that price as on the back burner, or how you said that we can do it. And those, if things do run good, we can always bring in the project, get them done. But right now, that's what we can do there. And then I'm agreeing with mine on not to, with the borrowing that money. So if we can, and then some of the projects that's in FY '20 that we have, we can always defer them back a little bit and not do them. How many projects there that's not done in FY '20? I think you said it, I forget, I was thinking of something else doing here. You did bring it up, and I wasn't
The
paying attention.
majority of them are going to be completed or under contract.
Okay.
I'd have to go through and crunch this, but
I meant to bring my FY '20, and you said not to bring it, and I should have brought that, could have been able to read it from there.
if I can let me try to summarize what I think we're hearing, and that you would like staff to go back in and look at the 20 projects that could be deferred, identify 21 projects that could be shifted to contingency to be done if revenues materialize, and readjust the plans to not borrow the 350, and to see that impact on fund balance with the goal of having minimum fund balance in the end of FY '22.
I just asked it, I like it from the board, Randy?
Well, I'm for that, but I think before we start dumping things or moving things, and I don't mean dumping, but I mean moving or saying that what is in 2020 that we're not going to do, we need to kind of project what we feel is the best impact on the bay, in the respect of, are we going to, let's say that this situation, because we're going to be talking about projections anyway. So let's say that this situation of our economy and the virus and social distancing continues. Would we be opening A as a lounge where social distancing would be a viability situation, and we would be able to get some of our businesses within the Bay open and get some of our staff back to work?
I would, that's what we would do, we would follow the plan that the president, the three phases, the 4 phases, and start with phase 1, and follow the thing that goes step, and see how it goes and everything, and,
Yeah, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about our building utilization. For example, if you're going to have, if we're going to use something, the lounge clearly is not going to be able to hold any volume. Building A would hold volume, but let's say that it, on the reopening, that it is you have to be at 25% or 30% what your normal capacity is. Building A would then be about the size of a lounge on a normal night, whereas the lounge would not be it'd be a viable hot dog stand, but that's about it. And
Well,
Building A would be a viable lounge.
but then you're trying to say you would say you want to sell food there too, also, right?
Well, no, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is getting people back to work and getting as much normalcy as we can possibly get using our bigger facilities. Because if you can't have a large group get-togethers, then Building A would be useless to the large clubs that now use it. We wouldn't be able to have that.
Okay, I see not going in the next, this email to a whole year about all these clubs, all these things having parties and everything. I doubt if they will, and if they still gonna have that social distancing and everything. Second place, if we're gonna be working on the renovation of the Building A kitchen, I don't know if they would be feasible for us even having that open for that time period. I'm not sure.
Well,
So,
and that's exactly what I'm saying. We're
That's right.
budgeting for things we're not using. Are we going to budget for things on how we're going to use them going forward?
yeah, I see what you're saying, James. Well,
I mean, if half the golf course closed down, I'm not saying it would, but let's say that it was something that a tornado came through and tore up half the golf course, would we be budgeting to repair that? Let's say that a law, for whatever reason, came through that said you can only have 9 holes as opposed to 18, then we would budget differently for 9 holes than we would for 18. Right now, we need to be budgeting prospectively different for the use of our buildings and the way that we're using them.
So what are you suggesting? I guess I'm missing the point. you're
Well,
suggesting.
I'm suggesting if we're moving forward and let's say that we put the lounge expansion for one. If we expand a lounge that we're not going to be able to use because of social distancing, et cetera, then that really isn't a good place to spend money. Whereas if we put it into Building A, and Building A then becomes our normal lounge, then that is a good place to use our money because
Well, Randy, that was my point about to make sure we don't do anything right now in the 2020 budget that would be a moot point in the 21 budget.
yeah, I'm not disagreeing with that, but the Building A is in the 2020 budget. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I understand.
So let me add another couple of things to think about, particularly with regards to the lounge. The design work that we're doing this year is necessary. It's a prerequisite to doing the actual work on the lounge. Now, if we find as we go into 2021 that things aren't coming back as fast as we thought, we always have the option of delaying the lounge. We won't throw away the designs. Those designs will still be good to use in 2022 or whenever. So we've not really thrown away anything. In fact, we've probably saved some money because once things do come back, people are going to be charging a lot more because there's going to be a lot of work out there to be done. We'll probably save money that way. Now, the other thing about that is, let's suppose that things don't come back real quick in 2021. It would still make sense to me to go ahead and do these major projects, because the last thing you want to do is have things start to gear up and boom for us in summer of 2021, and then shut down the lounge to do the work on it that we could have done while things were slow and it was closed anyway. It seems like that would really hurt us.
But what you don't want to do, I understand what you're saying, but what you don't want to do, and you say we could still use that drawing, and we're making a point of that, and I didn't necessarily mean to do that. The point is, though, you may be able to use that, but if we're going to spend that money, but we're still talking about laying more people off, we're talking about reducing the salaries of employees, we're talking about the possibility of increase in fees, we're talking about the possibility of having to increase assessments. I don't see the value of spending that $92,000 if you're going to use it, as an example, if you're going to use it 2 or 3 years from now, because we're talking about here and now when people are hurting. And I sure don't want to go and see those things. One of the questions I had is you have on your thing needing to be addressed next week, reduce personnel, operating expenses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Are we looking at that? Is that something we're talking about doing? No.
Well, Mike, that brings it back to my point. We need to be looking at the projects that bring staff back to work. We need to be looking at those things, not just at how we're going to budget, but how we're going to budget wisely to get the maximum staff back to work when things do start opening up. And our larger buildings are going to allow for more staff to come back to work. You're driving my point. We need to be looking at that. We need to be looking at taking care of not just our facilities, but of our people and of our commerce.
But you're still going to be talking about that social distancing, because you don't know where that's going to go, how that is going to, and how that's going to impact us.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you, Joe. That is exactly where we need to be following CDC.
So in other words, by doing that, so you will not be able to bring some of these employees back that quick. Probably some of them might wait and discourage and just go look for another job in it. But I know what you're saying. But I just want to go with it, what I brought up about how to adopt this budget and everything, and whatever else somebody else wants to add into that for the staff to work on. So if there's anything else you want,
Yeah, I want to say something. I know you're all thrilled.
Go ahead.
On the original budget, the original 2021 budget, the original one, in January, had several things that were taken out when other things were put in. And if you're going to add contingency projects, I would like to add the 3 for the golf course. The maintenance facility, the
I can't-
office, and the cart barn repair. I'd like to, what, you can't hear me? No. My mic is on. Maybe my mic's not working. Maybe that's you. There's 3 golf course, actually there was 5 or 6, but anyway, 3 of them I would like to add to the contingency projects. They're in the original one. They were taken out when the budget was redone. So in January, they were
I
in
see what you mean, okay.
Okay. The golf maintenance shed, I don't, it says, I only wrote down office and staff, I don't know what that means. But anyway, because I only wrote down part of it. And the cart barn repairs, I would like to add them to the contingency projects for next year. And if I was home listening to this conversation, I would have turned it off because I have no idea what you people are talking about. I sort of agree with, I think Mike and Randy and Roger talked about the same thing, but saying it differently. I think that, although I do think that the drawings and stuff for the building for the lounge should be completed. And if we use them next year, we do. If we don't, I think everybody's talking about the same thing, but a little differently. And I think that that's all I have to say.
Trustee Henderson, how would you like to pay for those items you'd like to add to the FY21 budget?
Well, I'm just saying, if we borrow, if in fact we borrow $1 million to do the lounge, and the lounge doesn't take $1 million, if there's extra money hanging around, I think those projects should be among the ones you're considering. Is all I'm saying. I'm not saying, just put them in, just put them in as if there's.
Well, to put them in, we have to have a revenue source or just take it more out of fund balance.
Well-
Unlike the federal government, we
Well,
can't print our money.
aren't you taking out from?
What we were talking about using, quote, contingency was leaving a funding source in there, but putting those projects asterisk in contingency to try to let the homeowners understand we weren't going to do them unless we got all the money in as planned. Adding projects.
I see what you're saying. Never mind.
Okay.
Never mind. I see what you're saying. I misunderstood that.
Joe, Mr. Chairman, one comment is we talk about what we think is going to happen, and we've all said the same thing. No one knows. But as in an email I sent to Mr. Coffey, I truly believe that we're going to have to be a little more particular here in the Bay about what we do as we open up and as we start using facilities, et cetera, simply because of the population we have. I mean, there's no question. We're not Melbourne. I mean, and to open up here with so many senior citizens that we have, I mean, we have to be especially careful that something doesn't happen so we become a hotspot. So I think we have to be very careful as the new plans come from the governor and the president and et cetera. We have to be very careful what we do here, because this population, if it became a hotspot, it could get bad.
That's what I'm saying, that even though he says go, say in June you do something, we might hold it back for about a couple of weeks, because like you just said, so
Right,
that's
I
why
agree.
I won't support some of the stuff and wait it down the road and everything, so, but.
I agree with that too. That we need to be really careful
Very
about
careful.
what gets opened up and when it gets opened up, because
Right.
this could be a disaster looking for a place.
I know everybody, you're gonna make enemies from now, you're gonna have friends, they're not gonna be your friends, but when the end comes in, they'll say, you know what, I guess you guys were right, and we appreciate what you did. So, what? Which one?
I said, I've worked here 6.5 years. I've never heard something like that.
Me either, and I've been on the board for a year and a half, so.
Well, I've been here doing this for, and there was a lot of people would be mad at me because I didn't support some, but then I supported some for that they wanted, and they were happy. So I don't know, maybe I'm living in a dream world.
That's
Don't
why,
say
that's,
nothing.
that's why they elect all of us, and that's why you're called leaders, is because you help to try to make decisions that are in the best interest of people.
So, like I did bring up, I said, to adopt the FY21 budget with what I said, take 150, 175, put in a contingency, put those projects on the back burner, whatever you want to call it, how you said it, and go with that thing they could, and we have no problem with that, and then, I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything else to it, or what, how you want to do it?
Did we decide about the golf course irrigation? Are we doing the less expensive one?
Yeah, right.
We just, oh,
Okay,
I just want to be sure of that. Okay, thank you.
So I will make those adjustments and get you a revised budget out to you. Probably won't have all the line items because we haven't changed most of them, but I'll get that back out to you for next Tuesday night.
yeah, they're gonna be and you're gonna bring in about the FY20 too?
Yeah, and
Okay,
we'll take a look at all 5 years and fund balance and
okay.
bring it back to you.
And I believe that what we go here, I think we're gonna go ahead in the right direction, even though everything that's going on will still, I think, come out good. Everybody gave their input into it, and it does make sense, so I appreciate everybody bringing their views and everything, so. Sorry, anybody else got anything for John? If we're done, then.
We have a meeting, we have a meeting when?
Tuesday,
And that meeting
Is
would
it
be
7?
to,
Pick up where we left off today with new information. Hopefully, we can put the budget to bed at that
make some
meeting.
decisions at that
Yes.
time, though? I mean,
Yes.
you know, because
We'll have our-
I don't mean this is simple, but it is to a certain degree. It's, you just got to make some decisions and say, that's it.
I'm optimistic you can reach a consensus next Tuesday night. We
Okay,
won't have to
thank you.
meet on Thursday. We'll still advertise next Thursday, just in case.
It's just that, I mean, this is pretty,
Yeah.
not simple, but it's pretty done.
okay, so
I just wanted to say to Mike that I think this year is more straightforward than last year was, even with all the da-da-da-da. I think this one's much more straightforward than last year.
thank you. So, I need a motion to adjourn. Meeting adjourned, thank you.